I will give notice to our executive branch folks. The questions have been coming at full speed. So I expect the same here as well, which has been great. While the control of Congress can cause some chaos for different teams, it creates great content for us. So selfishly, it's been great conversation talking about different scenarios and things. Wonderful. Now that we've got everyone on here, I will jump to introductions. So this is a powerhouse group of folks that I'm really excited to talk to for the next hour or so. So first, we have Elizabeth Noll, who joined Holland & Knight in September 2022 after serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary for House Affairs within the U.S. Department of Energy. In this role, she was intimately involved in the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides clean energy investors and other industry leaders with immense business opportunities as they seek to participate in the nation's transition to clean energy. Prior to working at DOE, Ms. Noll was vice president of the Coefficient Group. She previously served as deputy director of congressional and external affairs for the Natural Resources Defense Council, where she worked with Congress, the administration, and clean energy industry partners to develop federal clean energy policy for the building, transportation, and power sectors. Next, we have Greg Luer, who focuses his practice on representing global communications and technology leaders, including internet infrastructure developers, consumer electronics providers, and original equipment manufacturers. He advises these clients on internet privacy and data storage policy, internet infrastructure, supply chain issues, and many more issues in that sector. Prior to joining Holland & Knight, he was a managing director and attorney at an American multinational law firm. And before that, he served as a senior advisor for 2 members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which oversees regulated industries such as telecommunications, energy, and healthcare. And then last but certainly not least, we have Rich Gold, the leader of Holland & Knight's Public Policy and Regulation Group, and focuses his practice at the intersection of complex policy and political issues involving Congress, the executive branch, and the media. The Public Policy and Regulation Group has been ranked among the top law and lobbying firms in Washington by several publications. Prior to Holland & Knight, Mr. Gold served in the U.S. Senate for Senator Lloyd Bentsen as his advisor on environmental affairs, where he worked on issues related to environmental side agreements of NAFTA, and as well as during the Clinton administration, he was a special assistant to the Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Carol Browner, with whom he helped develop the EPA's Superfund reform proposal and its administrative improvements package. That is a lot. I could go on for days, as I've said, for every panel. So the ease with how you all respond to every policy question that folks have put in the chat throughout the day has been fantastic. We already have questions, so I will let you all dive right in with an overview of what things look like for the executive branch in the next 2 years, given the results we saw on Tuesday.
So I'm going to do my arc of history spiel. First of all, thanks for all of you listening in today. I love the fact that you just said superfood. It is a much better, I think we should change the name of Superfund to Superfood. But I think we're at this moment in time, and there's a lot of focus on the political noise. But one of the things Congress and the administration achieved over the last 2 years was sort of changing the paradigm for our economy going forward. And we're not anymore living in a world where the United States would be one of the only major developed countries not engaging to support its private sector in technology transition in key sectors. And so, what we have, at least for the next decade, is a much more collaborative interface between the executive branch and the U.S. government more broadly. And I should say, in an era of things that aren't bipartisan, with the exception of the IRA bill, obviously CHIPS and IIJA were bipartisan. But I think everybody thinks we need to be working collaboratively between the private sector and government to ensure that we can outcompete China in key sectors, and that democracy and capitalism remain the dominant global paradigm. So not small potatoes by any means. And I think we're in a space now where we've gone from passing the legislation to implementing that legislation and creating those partnerships. And we spend a lot of time at Holland & Knight with our clean tech team that Elizabeth is part of, our CHIPS team that Greg is part of, Greg straddles both those teams, working with companies in that space between the executive branch, and private sector development and deployment of technology. So I think that's a big change and transition that's coming and sort of sets the table for the discussion around the executive branch, because more than half of what's going to go on is just spending money. Spending money that has already been forward funded through bills and is not going to be clawed back, regardless of who's in the majority in each body going forward. Spending money around chips, spending money around electric vehicles, spending money around battery storage, spending money around recycling. All of these things are part of those bills, and obviously that doesn't even get to road infrastructure. And doing so in a strategic way so that each dollar spent is leading to development of new technology, is leading to making the West Coast ports more efficient, is leading to easing the transition to electric vehicles, et cetera. So, we'll talk a little bit about that today. Obviously, the more traditional part of the executive branch is regulation. And we certainly seem to be teed up for a significant amount of regulation, and regulation coming from different places than perhaps we're used to it coming. For instance, perhaps the most exciting thing going on, if you can consider anything exciting in the realm of environmental regulation, is going to be, the Security Exchange Commission disclosure regulation on greenhouse gas emissions and risk. And you've got things like that out there. In the past, we would have been focused on, EPA Clean Air Act regulations, and they'll be coming. They're there. But, we have the FTC playing a significant role with a new set of green guides coming out, the SEC playing a role with regard to, the disclosure requirements, and, then everything we're going to pile on top of that with OSHA and EPA moving forward as well. So, regulation, spending money for certain. And then, last but probably not least, particularly given where the president's been traveling and is off to after Egypt, will be international relations, both on the climate front, as is the case with COP27. And then obviously, Ukraine continues to beckon and be a major issue. It will probably be somewhat of a partisan issue if we're hearing House Republicans the right way. And frankly, sort of the global efforts behind the technology transition that we're talking about, the U.S. engaging in here in the executive branch and in Congress. So, I think that's sort of table setting for where we're going. It's a really exciting time to be in federal policy because these are huge transitions in onshoring of industries that are critical going forward for the global economy. And the challenge of doing it in a way where it's effective and we're able to produce high paying jobs here, and also, not end up in a place where, I think it was Jack Reed who said in NDAA discussions, a year or so ago that, us being reliant on China for semiconductors is equivalent to us being reliant on Germany for tanks in World War II. It's just irresponsible. So these issues are not, and not to diminish the importance of climate change and other issues like that we're talking about, but these could be sort of the future of the globe issues, and very interesting to be working in them at this time. Let me kick it to Elizabeth, who is all things federal funding, certainly on the DOE side, and we can go from there.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, I think just building off of what you said, Congress, 117th Congress gave the administration just a lot to do, a lot to implement, a lot to execute on. So, they're going to be, focused on that implementation. And the election outcome really wasn't ever going to change that. It does, however, on the margins really impact on how easy or how hard that's going to be, right? So I think seeing how the election played out and margins not being quite as significant as maybe had been predicted, maybe that makes things slightly less tense and oversight maybe a little bit tamped down, but still, I think that the executive branch is always going to be really focused on implementation. When I was at DOE joining the Biden administration on day one, staffing was a really big priority, given that there were a lot of vacancies coming out of the Trump administration. And that was just like kind of on baseline. And then you add IIJA onto that, and you have $62 billion to spend at DOE. And then on top of that, you have IRA. So staffing will continue to be a priority. And that I think is both creates opportunities, but it's also creates bottlenecks where there's not enough people to get a lot of stuff done. So that will continue to be, something that they're focused on, making sure they have the body to implement this effectively, and check all the boxes. The other thing that I will say, and Rich alluded to this, and just to dive a little bit more, is you can already see them teeing up and getting ready to start moving on executive authority through regulation. So, EPA has, their power plant rule, they'll have methane limits, they'll have emission standards for the transportation sector, fuel economy standards, the ozone and particulate matter rules. Those are all up for renewal or review. On DOE, they're already working through a slew of appliance standards that were backlogged from the last administration. So there's definitely a lot in the queue there to keep folks busy. And I think, different from what I've seen in the past is a lot of industry buy-in, right? I think because we have the carrot a little bit more from the infrastructure bill and from IRA, where that's going to ease the implementation of some of these regulations, that maybe, fingers crossed, that makes some of these regulations more palatable and less. And they also, I think industry really likes the clarity. So hopefully that makes some of these that maybe in the past have been quite contentious, maybe easier to move forward on and get, some clarity on the federal rules. At FERC, I think that's another one that has been kind of increased attention on of late in the last 48 hours or so. Lots of challenges there over pipelines and permitting reform and those kind of things that will definitely have influence on the executive branch. But just really, I think also the bigger just power sector goals that the Biden administration has. Really, I mean, FERC does need to move forward on those. So that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out with a full commission or not. And then the last thing I will just say, the Biden-Harris administration has really, from day one, prioritized like bottom-up, middle-out policies. I think that was really reflected in the legislation you've seen, from everything from, bonus credits for citing clean energy in a low income or an energy community, to domestic content provisions or prevailing wage provisions to really, shore up labor and kind of the workforce, really focused clearly on onshoring and developing, building out the infrastructure here at home. And so I think you're going to continue to see that emphasis on labor and on domestic content and on environmental justice. And I think that is really going, like, because these projects are so place-based, because these demonstrations for clean energy are going to be in communities, I think it's really important that emphasis is there, and it's underscored in the statute, and that you'll continue to see an emphasis from the administration on how to execute and make sure they're driving that forward, because that's, I think, going to be a legacy play for them in terms of how these are cementing these policies in place. And I think that's kind of largely what I had to chat about. So I'll turn it over to Greg to kind of continue on from there.
Thanks, Elizabeth. When in building on what Rich was bringing up with respect to partnership and government as a partner with the private sector, I think there's an enormous amount of opportunity in the new Congress to carry forward, for the administration's perspective, a lot of those objectives. I think when I think of this, I think the Department of Commerce is probably the best example I could conceive of, really, where there's an opportunity for two key sectors, the telecommunications and technology industry, to partner with the government to carry forward important objectives for both the private sector and for the administration. Just thinking about it in sheer numbers alone, just on incentive programs that Congress has passed and that the Department of Commerce is responsible for implementing, either through formula programs or through discretionary programs, through grant programs and the like. In broadband and semiconductor incentives, the Department of Commerce is sitting on over $100 billion for those two particular sectors through the Chips and Science Act and through the IIJA, for just to incentivize the domestic deployment and build out of broadband infrastructure, and for domestic manufacture of microelectronics and semiconductor equipment, and for fabrication. So that's an enormous amount of money under any administration, under any circumstance, for any program, and one agency is responsible for doing all of that. And so that department doesn't have enough people, doesn't have enough expertise, and doesn't have enough just capital in general to handle and tackle that challenge without the partnership with the private sector. They need understanding, they need expertise, they need direction. Congress can play an important role in that process as well, and will play an important role in that process, no matter who is responsible for running the House or the Senate. So I think that when I look at the next Congress and I look at the Department of Commerce in particular, those are the kind of unique opportunities that I see.
Wonderful. I guess to kind of talk election stuff before getting too in the weeds of policy, that folks have pretty specific questions. Right now, Biden is running on a high of better than expected results, and a lot of folks expected potentially a referendum on Biden going the other direction. What does that mean that's like newly unlocked for him because of this better than expected outcome? Is there anything that's on the table that might not have been? What kind of chips does he have with this better than expected outcome?
So, there are two ways to sort of answer that question. One is sort of the policy side of things, and the second is the political side. On the policy side of things, we're clearly in a place where, I mean, just in fairness, like, since Jimmy Carter, this is probably the best midterm performance by a Democratic president. And, Democrats have, I think, gotten used to, when they have the White House, getting shellacked and then being humble for 3 to 6 months afterwards, and making a speech about America has sent a message. I understand what that message is, and we're going to work with the new majority in the House and the Senate to achieve the people's goals and the good of the people. Not to say that Biden isn't thinking about achieving the people's goals and the good of the people, but suffice to say that the humble moment or period is not as necessary right now as otherwise would have been the case. So with a 5-seat majority in the House and a likely 50-50 or 51-49 Democratic majority in the Senate, I think they are in a position to actually do a little bit more with Capitol Hill going forward, and not go with a just executive branch approach. I would expect the Republican majority in the House will struggle a little bit with things like the debt limit and appropriations measures. So, those are places where the White House and the president can be helpful to them. For instance, President Obama was pretty good at the end of the day reaching agreements with the Hill, even though he had a closure. So, I think it's going to be a lot of focus, and frankly, the president has already reached out to Leader McCarthy. A lot of focus on figuring out how to work together there. Within the executive branch, we're now into heavy duty management time, right? So making sure all of this funding flows in a way under, right now, John Podesta's leadership with the Inflation Reduction Act, but through IIJA as well, and the CHIPS bill, that the government is investing in technologies. The government is spending money on projects that are going to deliver bang for the buck. Obviously, the government sometimes can take a risk on something that, you know, the private sector and Wall Street would not. And those are important things to do as well. But, you know, we have to be advancing the ball on clean energy. We have to be getting the semiconductor industry onshored here. There are certain goals that have to be met. So it's a lot of blocking and tackling and, you know, strong executive branch management that has to happen. And, you know, that will be a test for this administration, and it'll be a test at a time where, you know, many members, senior staff in the White House may be transitioning out. We'll see changes in the cabinet over the next year. And, you know, people come, people go, but the machine still needs to work. So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
you know, I think that's the, you know, practically, if he's going to use his capital on something, more likely than not, it would be, and, you know, we would see this in the State of the Union, it would be in the realm of, you know, calling on Congress to do some additional big actions beyond what we heard in, you know, his campaign speeches a couple of years ago. And we may see a little bit more of an agenda than we were going to see. On the political front, of course, this puts him in a position of the $64,000 question: does he or doesn't he? We've all been focused very much on whether Trump would run again, and there's certainly been talk around whether Biden would run or not, and he has been clear his quote unquote intent is to. But this really raises that issue now in a way, because it's hard not to come out of the election where your party does well and think to yourself, well, gee, guess what I could do with a second term? So I think that's really going to be the big issue, and we're probably 4 to 6 months out from getting an answer to that issue, and I'm sure the president will consider it, you know, in a serious way.
The only thing
You
that I wanted
mentioned-
to add, Teresa, just
Yeah, go
really
ahead.
briefly, not to repeat a lot of what Rich said, but just, I don't know that folks, you know, within some of the agencies also feel like there's still a lot of really important issues that this election didn't change, like gas
Mhm.
prices are still high and inflation is still a very like front and center thing. So, you know, it's not like there's a mandate to like do more. It's really like there's just really some sticky issues that still need to get addressed.
Yeah, we talked about this kind of in both the Senate and the House panels earlier, that like there's no one sweeping theme that did like these kinds of candidate, like this issue won across the board. Like in some places it was choice, in some places it was bad candidates that like people wanted nothing to do with. Like there's no sweeping like direction that says like definitively this is our area of focus. But what I was curious to expand on, Rich talked, or both talked about movement and personnel. Are there any indicators in potential changes in cabinet of folks we think might be on the earlier list to move on from the administration, and what that might look like?
I mean, I can take a stab. You know, I think initially we were thinking that the Treasury Secretary would be moving on here, you know, by the end of the year, shortly thereafter. There's now, you know, more words floating around from her spokespeople that she's not intending to leave. Of course, that would have, you know, that would have set off the dominoes, right? So obviously the Commerce Secretary had an interest in being Treasury Secretary. We have the vice chair of the Fed who had been considered for that job originally. So we could have had, you know, a lot of movement just based on that one move. You know, if that doesn't happen, I'm not aware of anybody else in the cabinet who's planning on leaving right now. And, you know, at least, you know, back in the day when I was in the Clinton administration, I think a lot of our cabinet heads at the time felt like it was the best job they'd ever had, and they weren't planning on going anywhere until somebody kicked them out the door. So that doesn't totally surprise me, but Elizabeth may have more intel than me.
No, I don't see anybody like raising their hand to sign up for a new job at this point. But you know, I could be wrong.
I will say on that though, you know, on the staff front, to survive 2 years as an agency chief of staff is impressive. to go beyond that is a bit of a miracle. So, you know, I think right below that level, right below the cabinet heads, there's going to be a whole bunch of staff moving around.
Ones that might not make headlines, but still have lots of influence and sway.
Two points I wanted to add on top of what Rich just mentioned is this. Number one, I think outside of the cabinet secretaries and senior executive personnel in the agencies, you could definitely expect some churn in the White House. This is now the time where the folks who are working 12 to 16-hour days, and they've been doing that nonstop for 2 years, and in some cases for folks that were on the campaign, it may be time for them to take a breath and move on to something different. Number two, in the event that the president does make a decision that he does not want to pursue re-election, that is when you could potentially see some changes with the secretary level. There are people in this administration who may fancy themselves as presidential candidates going forward, and in that case, there could be some movement. So we, as Rich said, we're 4 to potentially 6 months away from those kind of major decisions being made that could spark a lot of dominoes at the principal level with the departments.
I'm wondering what you think the next 2 years potentially looks like for Vice President Harris. Obviously, she has taken on choice as an issue, a big issue within her portfolio. That issue did very well for Democrats across the board. Potentially not a swing vote in the Senate anymore, depending on how the math works out. What does the next 2 years look like for her?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were just talking about, right? A lot depends on whether the president announces he's running or not running again. Obviously, if he's running, she is going to be playing a similar role, perhaps stepping out a little bit more on issues, hopefully other than the border, that she can take a leadership position on, like choice, as you mentioned. But if he is not running, she then has to position quite differently. Obviously, for those of us who have been around long enough, we watched Vice President Gore try to step out somewhat unsuccessfully from President Clinton's shadow and, run an effective campaign. He obviously ended up with a primary with Senator Bradley running against him. Just sort of a very awkward and difficult situation. So it's a very difficult thing to position for the top job when you're vice president, when you're sitting vice president in the administration. And especially when you still have your day job to do in terms of, key policy initiatives that you're involved in and fronting for the president. So that will be interesting to watch. Obviously, we have Secretary Buttigieg, Commerce Secretary. We have 5 governors now who all will look at it, including, Governor Whitmer, Governor-elect Shapiro, the governor of California, Governor Cooper in North Carolina, and then, a couple of senators as usual. So you have 8 to 10 people out there who are waking up every morning and, asking, has he announced yet?
Wonderful. I want to get to some of the questions in the chat on different policy areas. So someone asked if Greg to talk about ADPPA passage and if you have thoughts on likelihood there. A little bit in the
Right. I'd be happy to address that question. I think this really is dependent upon who wins in Georgia. In the event that control of the Senate does depend on Georgia at the end of the day. If it doesn't, and we end up in a situation where we're in a split control of Congress, there's always a chance that the legislation could advance. I think is a high likelihood of success in the House, in either in its current form or in a slightly amended version. The Energy and Commerce Committee passed that legislation out, I believe, unanimously. And though there's this dissatisfaction within the California delegation, both on the committee and at senior leadership levels in the House, including with the Speaker, which prevented the legislation from moving forward to a vote on the House floor, he did not see the same kind of across the board support for the bill in the Senate, primarily within the Commerce Chair and within other senior Democratic members of the caucus and the Senate. So, there are some things that have to change in order for that bill to move forward, in my view, in the next Congress, at least in the Senate. But in the House, I'm almost certain that when the time is right, that Leader McCarthy will allow for a vote to move forward because it is a priority of the incoming chair.
And then another policy question in the chat, is PFAS regulation a priority at this point?
PFAS, yay. There's nothing better. Wow, it took 28 minutes to get to a PFAS question.
For what it's worth, the question came about 9 minutes in. So.
Yes.
Okay. That's a me question. Not that I'm proud of it or anything, but so fluorinated chemistries are persistent, bioaccumulative, and long-term eight-chain chemistries are potentially toxic and cancer-causing. So these are PFOS and PFOA. Basically, think about PFAS as a substance that can coat anything and keep heat from burning it up. So obviously very important for industrial processes. And you cannot make an electric vehicle battery or a semiconductor chip without PFAS. So the challenge for the administration is we're trying to onshore electric vehicle battery production, chip production, and yet regulate PFAS, which can be, contaminating of groundwater and actually end up even in our blood. And so we have to keep PFAS out of the environment, which means you are going to have to put standards in place. We're expecting a drinking water standard from EPA anytime here in the next few months. The agency has proposed listing PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances under Superfund so the government can force folks to clean it up. This is going to be a messy process, and it's taking a lot of effort from EPA. I would say EPA is probably spending more time on this than they're spending on any other single issue, with the exception of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So, it's definitely front and center, will remain front and center, and an issue that we are spending a lot of time on here at Holland and Knight, both in the regulatory process as well as occasionally things are propping up in the defense authorization bill because DOD is a big PFAS user, as well as before the Environment and Energy and Commerce committees.
All right. How will the relationship with Canada be impacted, specifically as it pertains to supply chains and materials, and how those supply chains should come from more trustworthy sources?
Greg, that's a you question.
Yeah, I'll start. I don't think there's an easy answer to this question. There are, first of all, when you talk about supply chain regulation, that impacts every sector in the economy. And that has, anytime that the government is regulating or legislating in a space that has an impact on supply chain, you can impact domestic treaty obligation, international treaty obligations. You certainly impact international trade obligations. And I think the IRA is a really good example of when Congress elects to pursue a domestic policy objective that is important to the president. For example, I'll just use the EV consumer credit for Section 30D as an example. There were a lot of changes that were made in the law to extend and expand the credit, but make some very significant changes to the way it's going to be administered, who can access it, and which manufacturers can actually apply the credit for their consumers. And the way that the law was drafted has been interpreted in certain circles, both in Asia and I think in other parts of the world, as potentially discriminatory. So when you start to think about the way that these laws come together, and how that impacts supply chain policy, certainly could impact the relationship with Canada, and not just Canada, but more broadly across the world. So that I'm sure that's something that the administration is paying very close attention to, and I won't comment on the relationship between the president and the Canadian government, because that's not my area of expertise. But at the end of the day, I certainly think that there are some major issues that we're going to be vetted out through the way that the agencies are going to be interpreting the IRA, in particular, as where we could potentially have some hiccups with both in the northern border and then more broadly in Europe and in Asia.
And I would just add, and this is not specific to Canada, but just an acknowledgement that, for clean technology in particular, there's a $23 trillion opportunity on the table that all countries are going after. And so it does then start to, play out in different ways. And so it is something that I think is front of mind for a lot of folks that are trying to accelerate this clean energy transition.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I was just gonna say one other point. I would just sort of take this from a different side, which is Europe and South Korea, a number of other trading partners are not all that happy about our focus on domestic content. Sort of the requirement, for instance, in the EV tax credits for the auto tax credits that, it's only North America that will qualify. It's very much a situation where I think this is going to create collaboration on this side of the pond in North America, but create competition not only with China, but very possibly with the EU, South Korea, and other allies.
So we talked a bit in the Senate panel earlier about how confirmations will potentially get some increased attention because that's something that this Democratic majority in the Senate can move through without the support of the House. We got a question here in the chat about how big of a priority it is to get the 2 EEOC nominees confirmed and what that would mean, but I'd be curious to hear also more about broader confirmation and nomination strategy, given that the Senate, that's somewhere that they can potentially get more traction on than more typical legislation.
One word: judges. And I'm sure Todd talked about this a little bit, but the best way to beat Mitch McConnell at his own playbook is to beat Mitch McConnell at his own playbook. So I cannot imagine a situation in which the next 2 years aren't filled with at least like 25 to 30% of Senate floor time being judges. That's not to say that we're not going to do executive branch noms. We are. But that is an area where the minority can really, hamper consideration. And frankly, as we saw in the Energy Committee yesterday, sometimes not even the minority. So we may or may not have a delay on a FERC nominee because Senator Manchin is not terribly happy with the president's comments on coal right now. I think we will continue to focus on executive branch nominees. And I've been working a lot between the administration and the Hill on, for instance, environmental nominees and a few others. But I do think that I think Leader Schumer is sort of waiting for a window where there's some degree of rationality and a window to get a bunch of people through. And, almost every agency has somewhere between, for the smaller agencies like EEOC or EPA, it's a couple of folks to 3 folks pending. For, larger agencies, you're over a dozen with senior positions pending. It's going to be hard to get all those people through. And we are certainly at the point, being 2 years in almost, where some of those people have to decide how long they want to hang around in senior advisor status without being able to sign Red Border Review.
So we've got some good questions coming in. So how likely do you think the CDC will be successful in their budget increase request with appropriations?
The Congressional Black Caucus with their budget increase requests?
CDC. Sorry.
CDC, sorry. Okay. Do one of you 2 guys want to take this, or should
I'll try this one out for size, and
Go
then,
ahead.
and then if I screw it up, I'm sure Rich or Elizabeth will correct me.
No, we'll just laugh at you.
It wouldn't be the first time. So at the end of the day, the CDC hasn't particularly been found a major receptive audience for this massive appropriations request under the current composition of Congress. And I have a hard time imagining that kind of request would land well in a divided Congress either. Although the next 6 weeks may tell us something different, I have a hard time imagining that that's something that's going to make its way across the president's desk.
Yeah, I would just say generally on approps, the defense side of the House is $40 billion short right now. So the rich numbers that were contained in the House bills and the Senate bills on domestic discretionary spending are elusive in their sight. They may not make their way into conference reports. So, I think we're going to see some money come out of smoke and mirrors. Maybe, 20 billion out of smoke and mirrors and 20 billion, moved over from the domestic discretionary side of the equation. But that's a long way around to it's squeaky wheel time if you are fighting for a program that got pretty good funding in the House and Senate in order to maintain it, because really only a couple programs per agency are going to be able to get anything near what they were allocated in the House bill and the Senate reports.
Awesome. So we talked a lot about regulatory areas of focus. There's a question about what potential executive orders that we might see in executive action there.
I'm going to kick that to Elizabeth.
Yeah, I was reading that question. I was thinking about it. I mean, the president issued a bunch of executive orders, a ton out the gate, securing America's supply chains, focusing on the climate, a lot on environmental justice and equity and equality, gender equality, LGBTQ. So it's hard to see where there might be more, but I do think, to the extent there's outstanding, campaign promises, I would expect to see some creativity through executive orders and the use of the president's bully pulpit to kind of make those, campaign promises from the 2020 election real, like we saw with student debt. So I do think that there's always opportunity to be creative and use that. But I don't know that I'm like anything is coming to mind as like hugely outstanding that is like waiting in the wings, but I'm sure there is.
I'm a little bit less bullish on forthcoming big picture EOs from this particular White House, given the fact that there are many initiatives from the first 2 years that remain outstanding, which isn't to say that the agencies won't be able to roll up their those projects through the regulatory process, and then the president can then move on to additional items. But there's only been so much opportunity and time for that before you really start to think about the next election cycle. And again, focusing on what the decisions that this president is going to be making about whether or not he's going to be seeking re-election would probably determine how he's going to, or the White House is going to be using the EO process moving forward. When you start to think about some of the major EOs that were released over the past 2 years, a couple come to mind as that are ones that are really still out there is less defined from an implementation process, which could be in many respects viewed as the competition executive order that was released about a year ago today. You look at the cryptocurrency executive order that was released in the spring. There are very few, if any, kind of concrete actions that flowed from that. Lots of reports, lots of good thinking, lots of churn in the regulatory process, but not a lot of concrete action. And until those roll up, I think it would be challenging to see an EO kind of major release cavalcade like you see the first year of a new president's agenda.
And then another question we've got here is about DOJ and how a big focus has been on investigations of the Trump administration and putting up a firewall between the president and the Department of Justice. What might 2023 and 2024 look like for DOJ?
So it's hard to answer that without knowing how DOJ is going to answer the question about whether they're going to appoint a special counsel. So entirely possible that the Attorney General decides the executive branch is poorly suited to be investigating, the activities of a former president on the issues that are pending. I will note for the record, obviously you have the the Georgia investigation still going on with the grand jury and everything going on in New York. So the DOJ investigation is just one element out there right now. But I do think, obviously, Merrick Garland is an appellate judge for many, many years, is very much guided by, what justice requires on these types of things. And it's not going to shock, I think, anybody if that gets kicked to a special counsel, in part so that the resources of the executive branch are focused on real issues out there. So, one of the issues in the campaign, obviously, was people's concern about crime. We certainly have issues around political violence. There are lots of nuts and bolts, DOJ issues that are more domestic focused and more policy focused to deal with. In addition to, enforcement of the antitrust laws, which we've seen, both the FTC and DOJ moving pretty aggressively down that road. I would expect that would continue. I think we will, see a significant ramp up in environmental enforcement, which has already started from sort of the EPA perspective, but obviously will flow through DOJ to the courts as well. So I think DOJ is going to have a full plate, separate and apart from, anything pertaining to investigations around January 6th or, things that happened in the last administration.
Great. And as we're coming up on time, just a last question to kind of wrap us up here. So we've got a lot of folks from the private sector on this call who over the last 2 years have spent a lot of time in the legislative side of the world with all of these reconciliation bills. As they pivot to this regulatory side, what's kind of the advice and the strategies that you're giving to clients as they want to be more involved and hold more sway in this space?
Yeah, so I think my advice on this is simple, and frankly is no different from my advice at the beginning of the last Congress. With the forum shifting, the forum of the focus shifts as well. And I was telling people in last Congress, you may be laughing at Infrastructure Week. We've all witnessed Infrastructure Week for 5 years now. But at some point it's going to happen. And if you're not there, you will have missed it. And obviously the same thing on our climate bill and the CHIPS bill. So the lesson here is really easy. Be at the table or be on the menu. For these issues that you care about, especially some of the newer dynamic, including the spending of resources to partner between the government and the private sector, if you are not looking at that issue carefully and your competitor is, you are going to be competitively disadvantaged in the marketplace. And so, I think people need to take note of the ground moving under us all here, and the fact that it changes the competitive position of business in town to be paying attention to the executive branch and what it's doing, both with the carrot in terms of the new federal funding and the stick in terms of regulatory actions coming down the path.
I would add one more point to that, and it's not only do I agree with everything Rich just said, he pays me to say that, but at the end of the day, there's a timing issue involved. We are going to have massive opportunities at the Departments of Commerce, Transportation, the Department of Energy on competitive grant programs, the likes of which the government has never seen before and may never see again. We're talking about, as I mentioned, at the Department of Commerce alone, you have over $100 billion of capital that they will deploy through both competitive sources and through formula. At the Department of Energy, they're just getting warmed up from the battery grant, hydrogen programs, and other kind of matters for the clean tech economy, for which you'll have something on the order of $50 billion going out the door over the next 5 years. This is ridiculous amounts of money, but it's going to go towards very worthy causes. And people need to be paying attention early, because once the funding opportunity notices go out the door, that is not the time to start the work. If you are starting the work to implement your CHIPS Act application on February 9th or roughly thereabouts, when DOC will publish the CHIPS Act funding notice, you are 3 to 4 months late. And the companies that have been making effort and investing the time and resources to get ready for that are going to be positioned. So I would advise anybody really now to be thinking about what do you need to do to position yourself with a government agencies. Well, they'll still talk to you today because they'll stop talking to you a month, 3 weeks, 2 weeks before those funding opportunity notices go out the door. We've seen that time and time again over the last 6 months. And so I think that, it's not only getting to the table to avoid being on the menu, it's getting there early so that you can eat the appetizer, the aperitif, and make sure that you get a glass of wine as well.
And I would Greg lived that firsthand, and he couldn't be more correct. And just to layer on one additional point, I think with the House flipping in particular, like there's going to be an increase in congressional oversight. I saw that when I was working in DOE and House Affairs, and they were in the minority. So I would expect that to continue. And we've been advising our clients, good email hygiene and, be thoughtful. But I think also just like, these are to Greg's point, there is a lot of money, and that is the federal government taking on a lot of risk. And so, good partnerships, good projects, quality work, but also kind of know what good faith policy-centered oversight looks like, where we're really trying to make sure we are good stewards of federal taxpayer dollars, and where bad faith, politically centered oversight, what that looks like, where this is really about, media attention or efforts to gum up the works and make it harder for the administration to do their job. So, that those are both going to be playing out simultaneously over the coming years.
Wonderful.
Well,
Yeah, go for it, Rich.
No, I was just going to say, as I think the boys from Car Talk say, you've wasted another perfectly good hour of your time with us, and we appreciate it.
Wonderful. And thank you all again to Rich, Elizabeth, Greg, and the rest of our panelists today for joining us. I know it is going to be a chaotic, newsworthy couple of weeks, never mind 2 years, as we continue to see results roll in from Arizona and Nevada, places like that. Thank you so much to everyone who spent 3 hours with us today. If you missed some of it, we'll be sending out resources by email with recordings and things like that. So please, if you have any questions or things like that, send them our way and we'll be happy to help you there. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Stay dry.